Good morning, everyone. My name is Estefania Vidal, and I will tell you a bit about how teams enter the offensive zone in football. So the way this talk is going to go, roughly, I'm going to tell you what are entry zones and why you should care. A bit of probabilities because we have a very wide, varied audience, so maybe you don't know a bit of basic probabilities. And I'm going to focus on two types of entries to defensive zone, carry entries and pass entries. We're going to briefly discuss re-entries, which the team just before me already discussed this a bit. And then we're going to take a closer look to build-ups that are particular type of possessions that enter the offensive zone. So roughly, I'm a physicist, so I still work as a physicist. Basically, this is what I managed to put together on my free time on the past 3 weekends. So I don't have a team behind me, so that's kind of what I could do, basically. Okay, so what are entry zones? Why do we care? So the main idea is that the teams shoot basically when they are farther along the pitch. So you need to get there somehow. So here we have this plot from the Bundesliga last season, and here you have the percentage of possessions that ends with shots and how far the team advances in the pitch. So you start roughly 13% of possessions. This is really not showing. But roughly 13% of possessions will end in shots. And if you manage to make it to the last 2/3 of the pitch, then your probabilities of ending in shots already double. So you want to get there to be able to score goals, basically. So all you need to know about probabilities for this talk is the conception of conditional probability. So the idea is that if you have two events, and these two events are not independent, then you have the probability of one this event happening given that the other happened. So for example, let's say that you want to know if a goal will, the probability of a goal given that the shot was taken at a certain distance from the goal. So if you have all your goals and you plot a nice histogram divided by the distance to the goal, what you will getting will be the probability of that distance given that the event was a goal, because that's the data set you use, basically. But what you want is the flip around of this. You want to have the probability of event given a goal, that is a goal, given that the shot happened at a certain distance. And nicely, there's a very neat mathematical trick to bind these two together, and that is you simply have to use the probability of a goal happening and the probability of the shots happening at a certain distribution. So I'll be using this concept a lot, the concept of conditional probability. Okay, so how do teams enter the offensive zone? There are multiple ways. The first one is carries. A player enters with the control ball on his feet, basically. We have passes, that's self-explanatory. Clearances, when defenders just shoot the ball far away to get out of their area as quick as possible. We have long balls, usually taken by the goalkeeper, where they shoot the ball far away, cross the middle field, and then basically strikers or midfielders have to fight for it afterwards. And we have set pieces. So we'll be focusing on the first two, carries and passes. And I will be focusing on events that enter the offensive zone at some point. So I will be disregarding everything that already started in the offensive zone and never got out of there. And when I will talking about the offensive zone, I will be referring possessions that are in the last fourth of the pitch. And this is data from the past 5 major leagues in the last season. So the rule of thumb numbers that you need to have in your mind is that from all possessions that end the last quarter of the pitch, 29% ends in shots, and all those shots taken, 11% ends in goals. So your rule of thumb numbers are going to be 30% for possessions and 10% for goals. Of all the possessions that entered the last quarter, 73% do it through passes, while 27% do it through carries. If we took a look at the possessions with shots, then we see the percentage that does it through carries is slightly higher, up to 35%. So we can do this trick of conditional probability and flip this around, and we see that from all entries with passes, 26% end in shots, while from all possessions that end through carries, 36% ends in shots. So let's take a closer look at these carries possessions. So here what I'm showing is a density plot of the starting location for carries that enter the last quarter of the pitch. So darker colors basically means that more carries happen in that area. And what you see is that this is heavily tilted towards the sideline. So you have two big peaks at the side, and you have almost no carries that enter through the center line. If we take a look where these carries end, this is in this orange plot. The first thing that you notice is that the high orange color is very close to this, to where the cut was made, basically. So what it means is that these carries are very short. You also notice that the darkest color is slightly closer to the center. So you have a small going towards the center of the pitch. We can take a look. Here I'm showing fraction of carries versus how long these carries are. And we see that most of them are very short, between 0 and 20 meters. More than half of them are below 20 meters. If we now filter by the carries that enter with goals, here again, this is the same density plot, but for carries that ends in gold. We see a couple of features. So the first is that it's closer to the center. So here you see that the color in the center is much darker than before. And we also see that the peak are not so closer to the sidelines as they were before. So these effective carries are closer to the center. And we also see, when we take a look when these carries end, that they are farther into the field, and then again, much more center. We see how this darker orange area is closer to the center. So we then take a look at how long these carries are. We see that the fraction of carries basically shift its peak from between 0 and 20 to between 20 and 30. So 50% of carries that end in goal, enter defensive zone, are advanced between 10 and 30 meters along the long axis. So we can take a vertical cut here to make this a bit more clear. So here I'm showing the starting position of the entry carry in the y-axis versus the fraction of carries. That's really bothering me if this doesn't work. Okay, and here you see this very sharp distribution towards the sideline. So you see that 40% of the carries entered through the last 20 meters of the pitch of the side, and how only 10% do it in the middle 20 meters. And how this changes for goals, you still have this distribution towards the sidelines, but it's much more uniform. If we take a look at where these carries end, we see how this distribution shifts more towards the center, but you still have this very low area in the middle compared to goals, where the amount of carries that end in the middle of the field is much higher, and you still have this slightly sharp distribution towards the border, but it's not as high as with the old system. So now we can flip around these probabilities, like I was telling you about, and take a look at the conditional probability of this. So here we have the fraction of successful events. So what I'm saying is, of all the possessions that enter the offensive zone through carries of a certain length, what percent of them ends in shots? That's a blue line. And the red line is from all the shots taken from this distance, how many ends in goals. And what you see, this very clear trend of how the longer the entry carry is, most likely is that the possession will end in shots. We can do this also for the pitch distribution, and you see clear how for the extremes of the pitch, where the sidelines, the probability of having shots is lower, how it increases towards the center, in particular how it sharply peaks if a carry starts through the middle of the field. Similarly, where the possessions where the carry ends, you see that practically increases linearly towards the center, and carries that end in the middle 20 meters of the pitch are extremely dangerous, and half of them produce shots. So here is a good point to step back for a bit and take a look, discuss really these results. There's a very important point here in causality versus correlation. So what I'm saying here is that carries that ends in shot tend to be longer and happen closer to the center compared to entry carries in general. But the question here is, do they generate better opportunities because these carries are longer and are very positioned? Or is it the other way around? Is it because the field is already open enough that you have the possibility to enter more easily and through longer times towards the middle? And this also highlights a bit how much you can do basically with event data. So for example, to really assess this question, you will have to think about positional data, where the defenders are located, for example, some metrics to assess how open the field is, or like the team before us, how risky it is to enter through the middle, for example. Okay, that's it with passes. So with carries, take a look at passes. And here, the first thing you notice is how different this looks from entry carries. So here, I'm showing the density of where the passings that cross towards the offensive zone, where they start. And the first thing you notice is they're much evenly distributed. So you don't have these sharp peaks towards the sideline, but rather much uniform. If we take a look at where these carries end, we see that the darker color here is closer to the sideline. So basically, the idea is that passes in general tend to open the field, while carries tend to move towards the center. And this is clearly shown in this data. If we take a look at how long these are, we see that the passes tend to be much longer than carries, and more than half of them are between 10 and 30 meters. If we take a look at passes that ends in goals, we see how the higher probability is in the middle of the field. There are much more centers, not as uniform as before. And if we take a look at how these passes end, what is interesting, so the first peak is at the sideline, opening the field. But interestingly is that longer passes, the ones that are reach further into the field, are closer towards the middle of the pitch. In terms of length, there's no significant difference between all passes or goal passes. That's a difference with carries. And if we take a cut here, you can see this uniform distribution I was telling you about. So here I'm showing the fraction of passes versus the starting position along the y-axis of the field. And you see it's a very even distribution. While for goals, even though it's also even, it's slightly higher at the middle of the pitch. But if you see where these passes end, you see immediately how they open the field and how these passes end much closer to the sidelines. And even though you started with an even distribution, you have that more than 40% of these passes end in the last 20 meters of the pitch. So these passes just tend to open it. And you see how in goals, this is not so sharp. And you see that the passes that end in goals, they are much more evenly distributed. They tend to open, but not as much, and also not so far into the pitch. So they open maybe to the last 20 meters in each side, not the last 10. So we take a look at how these passes, I was telling you how these passes open the field, and you see how they have, it's fairly uniform, what angles basically the pass is shot. And you see that they go all the way from 50 degrees basically in both directions. And this is interesting to compare it to carries. So here I'm showing in blue all the goals that starts from carries that enter the offensive zone, and in orange the angle of the passes. And you see how carries tend to be much straight vertical towards the center of the pitch. And you see that 40% of the carries are between plus and minus 10 degrees. So the players really don't go much more vertical when they're carrying the ball, while with passes you have this much wider distribution. And these two distributions don't change that much between goals and overall distributions. Okay, so we take a look at the conditional probabilities, and we see that roughly stabilizes for the length of passes. So here we see the percentage of shots given all possessions that enter the zone given a certain length of the entry pass, and you see that it roughly stabilizes after 17 meters. So we don't see a clear correlation there, but we do see an important correlation with the starting position of the entry pass. And here you see, so remember how I told you that the rule of thumb was 30%? So basically, only the passes that start in the middle 20 meters have a higher probability than average to ends in shots, while starting from your pass from the sidelines had a very low shot probability. This is even more marked where the entry pass ends, and we see that basically ending your pass in the sideline gets to really low shot probabilities, but that you need to basically end your pass in the middle 30 meters in order to have a higher shot probability. Okay, so once you are in the offensive zone, is there an ideal time basically to regroup? And what I'm showing here is the fraction of success, fraction of events. So we have in green, I'm showing all possessions that enter the offensive zone. In blue, the ones that produce shots, and in red, the ones that end in goals. And here is the longest time they spent inside the last quarter. And what you see is how this is slightly shift towards higher times. So we see that goals basically peaks later than for all possessions, but also what is interestingly, and it's that it decays quicker. So here you see that you still have some shot probability, but is much sharper the goal ones. So if we take a look at the conditional probability, and this is a very like this plot. So the idea is that in blue is from all possessions, how long they are inside of the offensive zone, what percentage of those ends in shots, and in red, the percentage of all shots that ends in goal given how long they spend in the last quarter. So what you see is that the longer you are in the offensive zone, the probability of ends in shot increases. This is kind of what you expect, that after the players are a longer time in the offensive zone, eventually they kind of get anxious, they get a bit bored, and they just eventually shoot, basically. But what you see here is that your goal probability starts to decrease after a certain time. And what you can understand this is that the defense already had enough time to get organized, basically get to their correct positions, and they can defend much better. So basically there's an ideal time that roughly you can say that after roughly 20 seconds in your offensive zone, it's better to leave the offensive zone and regroup. And this ties nicely where they were discussing about hard resets in the previous talk. Okay, so as a particular type of possessions that ends in the last quarter, I wanted to take a look at build-ups. So what I'll be telling you about now is the particular case of possessions that start in the first quarter and eventually reach the last quarter. So you can think that counters are a particular case inside of these build-ups. So most of these build-ups start well inside the box, basically. And if you take a look of where they start for shots and goals, they tend to start a bit more open, a bit farther inside the field. This could be mostly the counter-attack possessions, but in general, most of them are started by the goalkeeper. So you can think of how long it takes them to reach the last quarter. So here I'm showing the percentage of build-ups, fraction actually, versus the second to reach the last quarter. And you see how most of them reach in the first 20 seconds, and then it decays very quickly. Most of them are already done by 40 seconds. And if you take a look at the conditional probability, you see that the probability of a shot ending in goal stabilizes and reaches, again, a rule of thumb of 10%, roughly after 10 seconds. So basically what this tells you is that after 10 seconds that you started your build-up in your own quarter to reach, if it takes you more than 10 seconds to reach the last quarter, basically the defense had enough time to organize and to get to their positions and defend properly, So you have basically, you lose the extra edge that gives you the build-up, basically, after 10 seconds. So we see that, so if you want to do a build-up, keep it under 10 seconds, basically. The probability of having shots is slightly lower, but it's still well in the 30% area. So it's not that bad. Okay, so you have to get there quickly. How? That's the first question. So if you take a look at the longest pass that these build-ups do, you see that your first peak is basically your average pass, between 20 and 30 meters. But you have a secondary peak that is at long passes, and this is basically the long balls, when they shoot it far across the pitch. And what we see, if we take a look at the conditional probability, is that you don't see, you really don't see a correlation between the length of the longest pass and the shots or the goals, but you see that even if you filter only for completed passes for long balls, still this tends to go down still. So basically, long balls, even if they are completed, they don't tend to give an edge, basically. That's the idea. Okay. So use cluster analysis to take a look at the different types of build-ups, and the main results were separated between build-ups that go through the left and the ones that go through the right. So the one I'm showing here in density, in blue color, the most likely possessions along the pitch that these build-ups take, and in color I'm showing just a couple of random examples. So the first cluster basically goes quickly to the right, stays mostly in the right lane, and it reaches, gets very close to the sideline. You can see this sharp peak here, before moving towards the center. While this other cluster that I classified it as the right, but gets much more towards the middle of the pitch, even though a bit to the left even, but then enters the offensive zone much closer to the center. So you see basically the part where they enter the offensive zone here is much closer to the sideline, while this cluster entered much closer to the edge of the box here. It's a bit similar, but not exactly, towards the left. So you see that you have much, so we have this cluster that starts basically towards the middle, goes towards the left, and then basically gets a bit too much to the left, basically gets closer to the sideline before entering the pitch, while this one goes most of the time towards the left, the sideline of the pitch, and then makes a crossing here, and even though it was through the left most of the time, cross towards the middle of the pitch and then shoots basically closer to the edge of the box. And this, you can imagine, you probably see this in a lot of highlights, when the player makes a crossing from the left to basically get better accommodation for their proper footness, and then shoot from here. So I organized all the build-ups in these 4 types, and what I'm showing here in green is the percentage of build-ups that end up in that cluster. And what you see is it was roughly well distributed. The 2 that were more likely to happen were basically the 2 ones that get too closer to the sidelines. So basically it can happen that you at some point lose a bit of control and end up too close to the sideline and a bit trapped basically there. So those are the 2 more likely. In blue is the probability of producing shots given a possession was classified in this cluster. And what you see is that the most dangerous one is the one that I was basically just mentioning, is the one that is basically goes to the left, but before it gets too trapped towards the sideline, makes an effective crossing towards the middle of the pitch, and then shoots much more centrally. So even though make most of the path through the left, the important part towards entering the offensive zone, it was done through the middle. And these are extremely dangerous possessions. Almost half of them, if they manage to do that, basically ends in shots. And the other one that is very dangerous is the one that ends closer to the box. This is towards the right, so it's a bit equivalent, but interestingly, it was not found this accommodation, so I think it has to do basically with footness, whether right foot or left foot. And what you see is that the other that is very dangerous is the one that enters the offensive zone basically most towards the middle, and then enters basically the box towards close to the edge here of the right side. So I don't have time to tell you how to finish up build-ups, but you can read about it in the paper that will be online. But just the short summary of that part is that the last event before a shot is more effective most of the time always to do a passing before the last shot. If you do a carry, the longer the better basically, and that back passes or back carries have a much lower probability than front passes and front carries. So if you want to do a longer last event, better to do a carry. If you do a shorter, between 0 and 10 meters, better just give a short pass towards the front. Okay, so your quick take-home message. The way the team enter the pitch, they tend to be towards the center. If they are carries, they go from the sideline towards the center. But if they are passes, they tend to open up the field. Passes much more effective if they happen towards the middle third, so try not to open it that much if you have the space to do that. If you can enter the zone through longer carries, this is by far the most effective way. The more center the carry is, the better. More than 12 seconds in the offensive zone, better to regroup. This is when your probability of goals starts to go down. Builds up, keep it quick, under 10 seconds. Avoid the sidelines, get too trapped into the sidelines. If you can cross towards the middle, better. Also avoid long balls. There's no data that shows that are actually more effective. And the highest chance to goals are shots after short forwards passes. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention and take questions.